Thank you, Axel, for the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And first of all, a big thank to all the staff of the association for the very good organization and for the opportunity of the conference. So today I will present the work I developed during my master at the University of Tarragona in Spain, which was centered on pollen analysis at the early Neolithic site of La Draga in Spain. So first of all, La Draga is situated at the northeast of Spain in Catalonia, and it's a lakeshore settlement situated at the eastern shore of Lake Banyoles, as you can see on the map. It was excavated since 1991, and it's an early Neolithic site corresponding to the cardial culture based on ceramic typology. And it was dated between 7,270 and 6,750 years before present. Two phases of occupation were identified in the settlement. And the site is really unique in Spain due to the exceptional preservation of organic matter in waterlogged conditions, so below the level of Banyoles Lake. Indeed, as you can see on the image, more than 1,000 wood posts of the Neolithic dwellings were recovered in perfect conditions, and also many wooden artifacts of quotidian use from the Neolithic community. So that makes La Draga really an exceptional site for bioarchaeology and for archaeobotanical studies. So palynological studies were already developed at La Draga through a 3-scale approach, because indeed at La Draga we have 3 different sectors which present very different sedimentary conditions. Sector C is completely situated underwater, as you can see on the map and on the scheme. Sector B and D is partially underwater. The archaeological levels are situated below the level of the lake. And finally, Sector A is the uppermost sector of the site, and it's subaerial. It's not situated underwater. So first, pollen studies were developed in the lake sequence of Lake Banyoles, and they allowed to reconstruct the evolution of the regional vegetation landscape and to identify for the first time human impact on the landscape through deforestation of the deciduous forest. But also pollen analyses were developed directly on the archaeological sediments, first on a vertical approach in order to reconstruct the evolution of the local vegetation and to reconstruct also the formation processes in the archaeological sites. And finally, in Sector B and D, we also developed an horizontal approach. So in order to analyze the spatiality and the social use of space in the Neolithic settlements based on pollens. So the present study is centered on Sector A, which is, as I said, a subaerial sector characterized by heterogeneous clayish sedimentation. So we have no waterlogged conditions of preservation in this sector, and we have no clear separation of the 2 phases of occupation. And in this sector, the archaeological structures are characterized by accumulations of travertine blocks and pavements, as you can see on the images. And in particular, also one structure, which is the structure 265, was interpreted as a fireplace during the excavations. So we have 3 different objectives in the study. First, to reconstruct the paleo environment, very locally based on the pollens from this sector, to reconstruct also the formation processes and the taphonomical aspects of the archaeological sediments, and finally, to explore the social use of space in the sector based on pollen analysis. So to perform this, we sampled around 10 grams of sediments per square meter in Sector A, as you can see on the map. So I studied 25 samples from the northern area of the sector, and we also integrated to the analysis 51 samples from the southern part of the sector, corresponding to different archaeological structures. Then we prepared the sample for pollen analysis, and we counted a minimum of 300 pollen grains. Then we perform different statistical analysis, so correlation analysis and cluster analysis, in order to see the relationship between the different pollen taxa identified and between the different samples and the different archaeological structures. And finally, we also perform the trended correspondence analysis, so DCA, and a spatial interpolation through the inverse distance weighting algorithm in order to explore the spatial aspects of the pollen assemblage. So for the results, here you can see the big pollen diagram of sector A. So it's not a chronological diagram, okay? It's not representing the evolution of the vegetation, but it's an horizontal diagram. So what you can see here is the pollen assemblage for each archaeological structures that were studied horizontally. So what can we see? We see first the presence in all the samples of the mountain vegetation coming from the surrounding mountains around the lake, and including mainly the pine and the fir. For the arboreal vegetation around the lake, we have the dominance of the temperate deciduous forest regionally, but also locally we have riparian trees just around the lake. But of course, the main characteristic of this pollen assemblage is the dominance of the open vegetation. Indeed, we have more than 50% globally of herbaceous pollens, so corresponding mainly to ruderal and herbaceous taxa and the crops. So what does that show us? Compared to the pollen assemblage of the other sector of La Draga and of the lake sequence, we can see really the minimum percentage of arboreal pollen at La Draga. So that shows that really locally we have a highly anthropized landscape, mainly due to the deforestation practices and the cultivation locally around the settlements. For what regards taphonomy and formation processes, important aspects that was studied are the NPPs, so the non-pollen palynomers. They correspond basically to all non-pollen objects that we can find in our samples. So to give you some examples, we found ferns and algal spores, but they were not very abundant in sector A. We also found, for example, glomus, which is a mycorrhizal fungus and is usually indicating soil erosion episodes, and it was quite abundant in the sector. And finally, we also found, for instance, coprophilus and ligniculus fungal spores, plus new NPP types of doubtful ecological attribution that were also described in previous studies in the other sector of La Draga, but they were neither very abundant. So the main conclusion of that is that the NPP assemblage represents the subaerial sedimentation conditions, probably not favorable to fungal development in sector A. We have also information from the detrended correspondence analysis that we performed. So we have mainly two main axes describing the repartition of our data. The first axis was dominated mainly by taxa indicators of soil erosion and associated mainly to samples from the stratigraphic unit 2002, as you can see on the map coming from the spatial interpolation. So that shows that this stratigraphic unit corresponds to a post-occupation clayish sedimentation that lay above the archaeological structures. And our second axis of the DCA was dominated by taxa indicators of anthropic activities and was associated, as you can see on the map, mainly to structures coming from the northern parts of the sector. So that shows that probably these structures were of social use at the north of the sector. And that led us to the last aspect of the study, which is the social use of space. So we performed the spatial interpolation on the pollens, and what we found is that there is an accumulation of anthropic taxa at the north part of the sector. So here you can see the interpolation of cereals. Here you can see Tiletia, which is a fungus that infects cereals. Here you can see Lamiaceae, so aromatic plants, but also legumes, also Rosaceae, so all taxa that can be potentially of use for humans at that time. and also the spatial interpolation of fire indicators, so mainly corresponding to the Carboniculus fungal spores. We saw that they also accumulate particularly in one structure at the north of the sector, which is structure 265, and which was interpreted as a fireplace. So this indicates the speciality of the burning practices in the sector. So the main conclusion is that the three structures of the northern part of the sector were probably associated with wild plants and crops, storage, processing, and cooking. To conclude very rapidly, so this study in particular showed the different aspects of human imprints in the emerged sector of La Draga, thanks to pollen analysis. So we show that the local landscape was very open due to anthropic pressure. We also saw that the NPP assemblage represent the subaerial conditions and the use of fire in the settlements. And we also explored the use of space linked with plant management by the Neolithic community. And for a general conclusion, it is very interesting to see the complementarity of the three approaches at La Draga, because in the lake sequence, we can study the regional environment and the human impact at a regional scale. But with archaeopaleontology, so to study pollens in the archaeological sediments directly, we can look at a more local landscape and explore the spatiality for taphonomical processes and human behavior. That's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any question, I will be pleased to answer.